Welcome to Soccer Files on the SDH Network, where we dig into the history of the game. Today, we're going to go back to the very beginning stages of Major League Soccer in 1993 and 1994. Welcome to Soccer Files. I'm Jason Longshore. Let's jump straight in. Pro soccer in the United States has a long history, but at the nationwide level, it started in 1967. You had two leagues that started in 1967, the National Professional Soccer League and the United Soccer Association. It was a blood feud between the two. There were tons of lawsuits back and forth. It really affected the success of either league, and they ended up merging going into the 1968 season. Well, at the end of that season, only 5 teams survived. Phil Woosnam, who came to Atlanta to be the player coach for the Atlanta Chiefs, became the commissioner of the North American Soccer League going into that 1969 season and helped keep some form of professional soccer alive in this country from an auxiliary room at Atlanta Stadium. It was at that point in the late 60s. Well, Phil Woosnam oversaw a decade in the 70s that the North American Soccer League went from very small to actually very big and had players like Pelé, Franz Beckenbauer, Johan Cruyff, George Best. So many legendary players played professional soccer in this country well before Major League Soccer started. Then things went south, and they went south pretty quickly at the end of the decade in the 70s. You also had the American Soccer League, which had existed for decades upon decades, but mostly as a regional endeavor. They went nationwide as well. Neither one made it. And after the 1984 season, the North American Soccer League went under. The American Soccer League tried to make a go of it. They changed names. Different clubs came and went. You had other regional leagues start. It was a little bit of the wild, wild west, and honestly a little bit sad at this point because nothing was sticking. And with all of the talk about soccer being the sport of the 80s, it became a joke because by the end of the 80s, you didn't have a nationwide professional league. You had a couple of regional leagues, and that was really about it. However, one of the elements of the United States winning the bid to host the 1994 World Cup was launching a professional league. Now, there's some debate as to whether it was a condition, whether at the beginning FIFA said you had to start a professional league before the World Cup in 1994. Different people will say different things, and we're going to leave that stuff to the side. We will talk about that at another time here on Soccer Files. There's a lot of interesting things kind of come into the fore about that World Cup bid. Let's separate it. And let's get into what happened when Alan Rothenberg took over as the head of the United States Soccer Federation. So, before the 1990 World Cup, there were some questions about the organization of the 94 World Cup. FIFA really pushed Rothenberg into this role. Rothenberg had been heavily involved in organizing the 1984 Olympic tournament that they were very satisfied with. They wanted Rothenberg in charge of the U.S. Federation and, in turn, in charge of the World Cup that FIFA had a lot on the line for. Now, one of the things that Alan Rothenberg told Complex Magazine, and there's a great oral history of Major League Soccer's first season, and it delves far more into the first season, but one of the first things that Rothenberg learned was that there was a lot of work to do on the World Cup bid and on starting a professional league. Neither one is actually an easy thing to pull off. So he convinced FIFA that the Pro League should happen after the World Cup, not before. He said, first of all, we had our hands full just getting the World Cup organized, and secondly, the likelihood that we could create sufficient interest and support for a Pro League before we showed them how successful a World Cup could be was pretty slim. FIFA went along with that plan. One of the reasons it was pretty slim was just 9-10 years before, the North American Soccer League had folded, and any other smaller effort to start a professional nationwide league didn't work. So you had a lot of skepticism of nationwide professional soccer in the United States. World Cup was a big success. Before the World Cup, you did have some seeds that needed to be planted on this plan to launch a league in 1995, and that was the plan at this stage. December of 1993 is where Major League Soccer became the first division in this country. Alan Rothenberg was the point person on the Major League Soccer plan. There were critics who pointed to a conflict of interest because Rothenberg was the USSF president at the time. The USSF Board of Directors voted to approve MLS as the first division league on December 5th. Bill Sage was in place very early on. He was the COO, the Chief Operating Officer of Major League Soccer. Bob Healy was the stadium development consultant, visited a bunch of cities over the course of the World Cup bid, was involved in MLS as well. Hank Steinbrecher was the Secretary General of the United States Soccer Federation, and he said at the time to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, January of 94, it was a question of whether to let the free enterprise system work or sanction one group to improve the chances for success. We didn't want the groups cannibalizing each other, so we decided to stand behind one group. Now, the groups that Steinbrecher's speaking of, you had the American Professional Soccer League, and you had League One America. League One America, we could do a Soccer Files on it in and of itself because of how odd and strange the plan was. It wasn't soccer in any form of a traditional sense. That's a whole nother story for another day. One element of League One America that actually was looked upon very fondly by the USSF was the idea of building stadiums and building soccer-specific stadiums. That is something that influenced and inspired Major League Soccer in the USSF. The APSL is another topic entirely. They were coming off of a 1993 season that had 7 teams. A few teams you're going to recognize. The Vancouver 86ers, who later became the Vancouver Whitecaps, that still survive in Major League Soccer today. The Colorado Foxes, the Tampa Bay Rowdies, which was not a direct relation to the original Rowdies of the NASL, used the name. There were some links. The Los Angeles Salsa, the Toronto Blizzard, the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Again, not a direct link to the NASL Strikers, but some common threads. And the Montreal Impact. They finished last in the league, and it is the same Montreal Impact that survived today in MLS. So the APSL had 7 teams, and had been pretty unstable over the years. That 7-team league in 1993 had grown from 5 in 1992, but you only had 3 teams that went from 92 into the 93 season. You had a lot of turnover, and USSF didn't feel that the APSL was going to be able to make a go of it. And I want to go back to Steinbrecher's comment about a question of whether to let the free enterprise system work. There had been a decade of basically letting it work, and it didn't lead to anything. There had also been an effort by Werner Fricker, who was the USSF president before Alan Rothenberg, to let this professional league start out of the national amateur kind of system and help those teams become professional. And it was essentially the free enterprise system. That didn't get anywhere either. So Alan Rothenberg, Hank Steinbrecher, the USSF, decided to sanction one league as the first division and try to give it every chance to succeed. Major League Soccer was the one that got that. Now, the APSL did continue on, and the Atlanta Ruckus joined the APSL ahead of the 1995 season. That league ended up merging with the USISL, which was not looking to become the Division I professional league at that time, was looking at a system below that, but they merged with what was left of the APSL after the 1996 season. Again, maybe more topics for other Soccer Files episodes. Let's go back to Major League Soccer. So they get the sanctioning in December of 93. Rothenberg said at the World Cup draw, the cherry on the icing of the cake is the successful launching of a professional league. At the very beginning, the idea was to go to the 27 cities that had bid to host World Cup matches, along with 6 more as potential locations for MLS teams. They expected, and this is at the end of 1993, to need $100 million in startup costs. They planned to start with 12 teams. There was a plan in place for some of the seed money to get this underway and off the ground was to come from profits from the 1994 World Cup. That led to some controversy as well. Again, there was talk about conflicts of interest involving Alan Rothenberg. It ultimately did happen, and it helped get MLS off the ground. That's another topic that we'll get into as we go. Lamar Hunt was one of the first people that the league met with about becoming an investor. No surprise, he stuck with the North American Soccer League for a very long time, heavily involved in American professional sports, very well respected. He was one of the first calls that MLS made. Steinbrecher in February said something that was very important and I think set the tone for what MLS was intending to do. Steinbrecher said, and he did use the MLS. Some people get bent out of shape about that. This was February of 94, by the way. The MLS must ensure the success of its weakest franchise because my perception is that if one team folds, MLS will fold. Now, you found out that wasn't the case later on, but that was the attitude coming out of the North American Soccer League where for the final 5-6 years of the league's existence, most reporting was around who was going to fold or who folded rather than any successes the league had. That's where that attitude came from. So they did not want to see anybody fold. It took a while. It did happen, but they were able to survive it because of the foundation that was built. But that was the fear going in, was they were only as strong as their weakest club. So we're going to go chronologically here, and we'll start with January of 1994. The league has its sanctioning. What was going on around the country as everything was starting to come together? Now, remember, the World Cup was the summer as well, so that was taking up a lot of the bandwidth of soccer coverage in this country at that time, too. Tulsa, Oklahoma, was one of the first cities to announce their interest in putting together a local bid. New Jersey was interested as well. The governor, Jim Florio, was leaving office in January. He said he believed that New Jersey would have an MLS franchise. He was also linked at the time with becoming the MLS commissioner. He downplayed that, but Jim Florio was linked with that possibility. So late in January, the organizers held a bidders conference. Bidders were told at that time that each group would be expected to sell at least 10,000 season tickets and to have plans for a stadium, either an existing one or to build one that would seat between 20 and 30,000 people. Bids to join the league were due by May 15th, and this conference was at the end of January. The league was also expecting to have most of its financing in place by April, according to Hank Steinbrecher. 29 cities were involved in that conference, and this is from Doug Chapman of the Providence Journal. Atlanta, Boston, which was going to be based in Foxborough, Buffalo, Charlotte, Chicago, Cleveland, Columbus, Ohio, Dallas-Fort Worth, Denver, Detroit, Houston, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Memphis, Tennessee, Miami-Fort Lauderdale, Milwaukee, New York, New Jersey, New Orleans, Orlando, Phoenix, Pittsburgh, Portland, Sacramento, St. Louis, San Francisco, Seattle, Tulsa, and Washington. Now, San Diego was not part of that, but San Diego turned some heads with a Mexico-Bulgaria friendly at Jack Murphy Stadium that drew 56,222 at the end of January. So people were kind of hoping San Diego would put something together. Seattle, which was part of that conference, drew 43,651 for a friendly January 29th between the United States and Russia at the Kingdome. So you had a lot of things going on in January of 94. A lot of those cities that we just mentioned have come into the league or are about to come into the league in Sacramento and St. Louis and Charlotte's case. No Austin, Texas there. You did see some things emerge later on, but very interesting to see so many of those cities that are involved. February of 94. Fort Lauderdale Strikers owner Amancio Suarez. This is going to be a long-running thread because Suarez talked about wanting to join Major League Soccer and wanting to be part of this. And there's a very specific reason why, because he had some big money that he thought was backing him that could take that club into a very big situation. One reason he wanted to join Major League Soccer was his league, the APSL, was down to 5 teams at the start of the year. The Tampa Bay Rowdies went under. They had some negotiations at one point with a business group in Jacksonville to move to Jacksonville, Florida. That didn't happen. So the Tampa Bay Rowdies folded. So you're going from, at this point, 7 teams in the 1993 APSL season to now 6, and then he said 5. Another one was going to fold. They ultimately ended up with 7 teams with a couple new faces coming into the league for 1994, and Fort Lauderdale did play in the 1994 season in the APSL, but they were pushing. They were pushing to try to get into MLS. Suarez was keeping all of his options on the table. It came up a lot at this time that MLS was competing with the APSL for fan support, for corporate sponsorship, for TV rights, all these different things. Look, the APSL was barely holding on at this time. They did a great job to hold on, but these were leagues trying to operate on 2 different platforms. Let's talk about Atlanta, and we've done a Soccer Files about the history of MLS bids in Atlanta. To keep you up to date in the timeline, in February of 94, the Atlanta Sports Council expressed their interest in bringing a team to town. Doug Kress at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution wrote about it. Rothenberg said, "The response from the Atlanta community has been terrific. It's been one of the quickest to respond positively. Atlanta just leaped right in there, and I'm sure Coke will want to be involved in an ongoing basis with Major League Soccer." The 3 stadiums they were looking at that time was DeKalb Memorial Stadium, a proposed stadium at Life University that would have seated around 20,000 people, and Bobby Dodd Stadium at Georgia Tech. Indianapolis submitted their letter of intent. They were exploring using the Butler Bowl as a stadium. They were also asking soccer fans in Indy to submit a down payment of $75 per ticket for season tickets. Philadelphia was not on that original list. They tried to get some local momentum after not being involved in that bidders conference. So the bidders conference was not the only way to eventually submit a bid. Philadelphia was one trying to put something together behind the scenes. The New Jersey team was looking at playing at a renovated Rutgers Stadium. They were not looking at Giant Stadium at the very beginning. Tampa joined the fray. They submitted a letter of intent in late February. Tampa Stadium, the University of Tampa, and the University of South Florida were all possibilities at this point. Part of the MLS plans, as we mentioned, was to build those 20 to 30,000 seat stadiums. The University of South Florida wanted to have a Division I AA football team playing in a stadium of that size by 1997. So your timelines were kind of aligning here. They might be able to find a successful partner to build a stadium of that size. Also, outside of the city's bidding, there was some discussion on what the structure of the league would look like actually on the field. There was a lot of back and forth about how many foreign players would be allowed to be part of rosters. 3 to 5 seemed to be the range considered at the beginning stages of 1994. There was also a big push by Alan Rothenberg to have all of the top U.S. players involved in Major League Soccer. He looked ahead and saw that if the United States had a good World Cup, that those players would become stars, and having them involved in the launch of MLS would be a very good strategic move. So he started the ball rolling in that direction. Per reports at the time from multiple sources, local investors were being asked to put up $10 million each. So they said originally they wanted $100 million to be able to get off the ground. They were looking at 12 cities. Reports at this time had local investors being asked to put up $10 million each. So it looked like maybe hedging bets just a little bit. Now, by the time you got to March, and this is only a few months after being sanctioned, a TV deal was announced with ABC and ESPN. That was huge. That provided a lot of legitimacy. In the APSL side of things, you had the Houston Force, the Seattle Sounders, which, yes, are the Seattle Sounders that exist today, and the Toronto Rockets joining the APSL to bring them to 8 teams. Now, they ended up with only 7. Again, the musical chairs of the APSL. You had plans at that time to add another 4 teams in 1995 and eventually go to 16. The APSL was looking at how to compete with MLS when they did not get the Division I sanctioning. They were really struggling just to keep the doors open, but they had big plans, and they didn't quite come off, but they had big plans. Fort Worth Star-Telegram said that Austin was also bidding for an MLS team and said that there were 49 bidding cities on March 11th. So going from that original bidders conference to now, you've had a bunch of people come into the mix. Austin was one. Greg Coate in the Miami Herald said that Alan Rothenberg was coming to Miami to personally lobby Amancio Suarez to invest in MLS and claim a team. Greg Coate criticized the single entity concept and said it was keeping people from investing. Suarez questioned the single entity concept as well in a quote. Here's why they wanted Amancio Suarez and the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Wayne Huizenga of Blockbuster. You got to remember, 1994, Blockbuster was a huge deal. Wayne Huizenga signed a big sponsorship deal with the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Now, Greg Coate said that Huizenga was wary of the MLS structure as well, but MLS and U.S. Soccer wanted the Strikers and Suarez and Huizenga's money backing it to come into the league. So this dance continues for a while. Steve Winter was the media relations director for the APSL. He told Frank Giassi of the Record about Seattle joining the APSL. There was a lot of arm twisting with the federation saying not to go with the APSL, but to wait for MLS. The Seattle people wanted to get started right away. Winter said they almost added a Long Island team to the APSL for 1994, but they backed out at the last minute. And he said it would have been an Italian team. I don't know who or what that would have been. Julie Cart of the LA Times joined the growing chorus of people questioning MLS March 15th, 1994. Now, she was asking about some very specific things. We mentioned seed money coming from the World Cup organization to help get MLS off the ground. Cart asked about that. $500,000 coming to fund the business plan that earned the sanctioning of U.S. Soccer. That's an example. Questions about the nonprofit World Cup organization giving money to the for-profit Pro League. The World Cup Board of Directors voted to give MLS $3.5 million for startup costs. And Cart said the IRS was reviewing the tax ramifications of that. Some of the questions in the piece, why bankrupt the World Cup, why take the risk, were ridiculous. There was no risk of bankrupting the World Cup organization. That was hyperbole. The same piece, and remember, you had a team in Los Angeles in the APSL. The same piece had a section saying that the APSL was going to challenge the MLS for supremacy. The chairman, William De La Pena, who was the owner of the Los Angeles Salsa, he mentioned the 1967 antitrust case between the two leagues that the NPSL filed against the United States Soccer Football Association and the USA, the United Soccer Association. He kind of incorrectly cited it. I don't know if he knew all the details of it. He said, look at the 1967 antitrust case. It was dropped when the teams merged. So it never even really got decided upon. Weird stuff going on at this time, and this kind of shows you where American soccer was incredibly fractured at this point. So Rothenberg later said at a press conference, and maybe down to some of this pressure, that private investors would pay back the startup costs for MLS to the World Cup organization or to the U.S. Soccer Foundation, which was getting the profits from the World Cup. That was another area of questioning, was why were you taking money away from the U.S. Soccer Foundation that was going to get started with these profits to start MLS? Rothenberg said that the private investors would pay back these startup costs to the World Cup organization or to the foundation, depending on the timing. He estimated in mid-March that those startup costs were slightly more than $1 million. So the business plan and whatever else was involved at this stage. That TV contract was announced on March 15th. 10 matches on ESPN, 25 matches on ESPN2, championship match on ABC, no rights fee. MLS bought the airtime and would sell the commercial time for the ABC championship match. ESPN did pay a rights fee according to reports, and ESPN International would be distributing broadcasts abroad. Rothenberg said at the time it was a multi-year deal. Mark Abbott, who is still with Major League Soccer, came on board as an MLS vice president at this time as well by mid-March. Robert Kraft's name came up as a likely investor in MLS on March 18th in the Boston Globe and would be placing the team at Foxborough Stadium. That ended up happening with the New England Revolution. Now, we mentioned the USISL. Francisco Marcos, he was the founder of the USISL, which had started as a Texas-based indoor and outdoor league, and by this point had expanded nationwide. Small budgets, very low level. You had a number of teams in the Atlanta area over the years. Marcos said that he wanted his league to be what the CBA was at the time to the NBA. Maybe a better description in current times is what the G League is now to the NBA. At a March 23rd press conference in New York, Marcos announced that the USISL would be testing some potential rule changes during the 1994 season for MLS to consider when they launched. They got kind of weird. You had different divisions in the USISL testing different things. You had a larger goals in some divisions. You had it's been lovingly called the charge of the light brigade, where when a team committed a certain number of fouls, a player started from the edge of the center circle in their attacking half. So they got a 10-yard head start. Everybody else started on the midfield line. Whistle blows, and that guy takes off towards goal. And the goalkeeper's in the goal, but he's being chased by everybody else, and he's got a 10-yard head start. Just madness. Absolute madness. But they were trying all kinds of different things. The USISL was on board. We're trying some stuff to give MLS some options if they were looking for these rule changes. So teams that were trying to put together their bids for that May 15th deadline. Most cities were looking at deposits for season tickets for $75 for adults. Some cities had a $35 option for kids 18 and under. Columbus, Ohio was really interesting to follow at this time because they partnered with Kroger to sell the deposits. That included a $10 Kroger voucher for every adult package purchased. That's why Columbus sold the most of these deposits, and that's why Columbus got a team, to be perfectly honest. They blew everybody out of the water with the deposits, and that partnership with Kroger was a big part of it. Indianapolis reportedly sold around 1,000 deposits in their first 3 days. San Jose, California joined the push in March. Sacramento had the support of their Visitors and Convention Bureau, selling general admission season tickets for $75. They were going to sell box seats at $300 and suites at $2,500 for season tickets, I would assume. And by the end of the month, going back to the whole idea of that, I guess, $3.5 million bankrupting the World Cup, it was looking at the end of March like the World Cup would make far more than the $20 to $25 million that had been originally planned for. Things were looking very good on the World Cup side. Ticket sales were very good. Other monetization efforts were very, very good. So the World Cup was going to be a massive success. Let's move into April. By April 1st, the plan was still for Major League Soccer to kick off in 1995. The league was shooting for an average attendance in 1995 of 12 to 13,000 people per game. The bids were still due in mid-May, and communities had until June 3rd to submit those final season ticket deposit numbers. An MLS official said in early April that Tulsa and Indianapolis were the, quote, shining stars of the bid competition. Now, neither one ended up getting teams. Both are involved in professional soccer now in the USL Championship. But those two got out of the gates in a big way. And Tulsa had a successful North American Soccer League team in the final years. The Tulsa Roughnecks were one of the shining stars of the late NASL period. There was a thirst for soccer in Tulsa, Oklahoma that different people had done a very good job of growing. Now you have FC Tulsa still doing a very good job. Indianapolis with Indy 11 is still talking about MLS from time to time. They haven't been able to get the stadium side down, and if they do, then it'll be very interesting to see if they get it. Tulsa and Indy were looked at as two very early MLS cities. Didn't come together for either one of them. April 5th, Pittsburgh launched their season ticket push. They opened an office downtown. They were looking at playing at an expanded Turtle Creek Stadium, also known as the Wolve Arena, that'd go from 10,000 seats to 15,000 seats. Season tickets in Pittsburgh were planned to be $150 for adults, $112.50 for kids under 18. The next day, a group popped up in Phoenix that was trying to bring a team to a proposed 30,000-seat stadium at Mesa Community College. Sun Devil Stadium would be used temporarily while the stadium was getting built. The organizers were trying to raise $41,000 for promotional items to get people to buy season tickets. Not a good look there for Phoenix to get things together. Atlanta, during the week of April 18th, mailed out 34,000 season ticket brochures. They had settled on DeKalb Memorial Stadium as their proposed venue. It was seating 15,000 at the time. There was a lot of talk about DeKalb Memorial being renovated in a big package for the 1996 Olympics to be a training facility for track and field. Ended up falling out. Nike was going to be involved in that. It was a big thing at the time, and it did not come together. Philadelphia did announce their bid during the week of April 18th. They were looking at the stadium at Villanova, and they were working to change the surface from turf to grass. April 19th is when Tampa announced their efforts to sell 10,000 season tickets. They felt like they had a bit of an advantage over Orlando, who had World Cup games coming. Tampa did not. Tampa was one of the first cities to really get on board with the World Cup. They got passed over at the very end. They thought MLS, they could get in over Orlando, who was distracted by the World Cup. And ultimately, they did. It took a while for Orlando to come in. They eventually did. Now, Tampa Stadium was looked at as the short term, and they were still looking at this point at building a stadium on the campus at the University of South Florida. They were looking to contribute up to $5 million to help build that on-campus stadium that would seat between 20 and 30,000. Now, ultimately, the University of South Florida's football team played at, don't know if they actually played at the Tampa Stadium. They do play now at the same place the Buccaneers play. So they did not build their on-campus stadium. You had a member of a sports marketing and promotion company based in St. Petersburg, Hank Tuohy. He was being paid by MLS to help the season ticket drive in Atlanta, Memphis, Louisville, who was now in the mix, and Tampa. Rothenberg said in April that he had raised 2/3 of the estimated $100 million needed to launch the league. That became a little questionable later on. San Jose officially launched their bid on April 21st. Dan Van Voorhees, who was the owner of the San Francisco Bay Blackhawks, who had played in the APSL in 1992, took the 1993 season off and were not planning to play in 1994. Van Voorhees was heading up this bid. Laurie Calloway was the coach of the Blackhawks, who had not coached in a while, and they had 14 players under contract through 1995, which created a really interesting situation that we'll get into as we go. You didn't have anybody else with that kind of situation who was trying to get into MLS. The Blackhawks were a really successful team. They participated in the CONCACAF Champions Cup in 1992, the forerunner of the CONCACAF Champions League. They won the APSL in 1991. National team players like John Doyle, Marcelo Balboa, Dominic Kinnear, Troy Dyack, Eric Winalda played for the Blackhawks at one point. A number of big-time players were part of this club, and they had guys under contract. Now, they did play in the USISL in 1993. Not all of their top players played in it that season, but they were pushing to get into MLS, and it's a little interesting in how that came together. So let's move to May of 94. You got your bids due by the middle of the month. May 1st, a Boston Globe article had this quote from Alan Rothenberg. In due course, Major League Soccer will take its place right next to the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NHL and become the fifth major professional team sport in the country. Due course is fair. It maybe was a longer course than people thought it would be at the time, but that was the ideas that Alan Rothenberg had at the beginning of May. Bill Sage, the COO of MLS and the acting commissioner at the time, said that South Florida was ruled out for joining MLS on May 2nd. Said they had fallen too far behind the rest on the process, including those ticket deposits. Amancio Suarez, Wayne Huizenga were basically promised a team if they wanted it, but they weren't comfortable with that single entity format. Later in the month, Rothenberg said that he had had conversations with Huizenga about an MLS team and hoped that Huizenga would build a 20 to 30,000 seat stadium. And I think they were targeting somewhere either on the campus or near what was then Joe Robbie Stadium, which is now Hard Rock Stadium and has been renovated since. But I think there was land there that they were talking about building the stadium on. Randy Vitaja, who was a former New England Patriots player turned agent, he was leading the push to bring MLS to Boston, said Robert Kraft would be the key, along with an interested group of businessmen. When Kraft purchased Foxborough Stadium, he helped kind of push that venue from not in the mix to a World Cup host site. That led to the connection to bring MLS to Foxborough. May 8th, Orlando season ticket sales were announced as very slow, and the organizers said that the World Cup ticket sales were hurting the MLS deposit sales, exactly what Tampa thought might happen, and Tampa was proven to be prophetic. Tampa Bay got a big boost when Checkers agreed to print up 300,000 season ticket reservation forms, including a coupon for a free order of French fries to put inside the bag of every order. Now, Tampa sold less than 1,000 deposits, according to local reports, on May 11th. Tampa also locked down the financial terms of renting Tampa Stadium. So Tampa had a lot of things happening all at once, but they did lock down a venue. Season ticket sales weren't good, but they had this partnership with Checkers now that would help get it out to more people. In the city, there was that disillusionment to deal with because Tampa was the first to support the World Cup efforts and was not picked to host games. So you had to kind of re-energize the soccer community in Tampa. Maybe that had a hand in why things were slow for the mutiny eventually. They never really did get it re-energized after some of these things. Hard to tell how much of an effect all this had. By May 10th, Columbus was outpacing everybody. 11,482 season ticket deposits. According to reports at the time, 4,000 were bought by individuals. Area companies bought the rest to put them over the top. May 11th, Louisville held a press conference. Their plan was to use the proposed University of Louisville Stadium. They later got support from Kroger, the Kentucky Kingdom, which is a theme park, and the Louisville Redbirds, which was at the time a AAA baseball team. There were incentives with all of those individual groups to spur season ticket deposits. Now, also at this time, MLS had some reports out there that they were dropping that minimum investment from $10 million to get in the door to $5 million. And they'd also approached Wall Street looking for financing. Also, it was floated out there that they could start with 10 teams rather than 12. Also started to get some chatter about delaying the announcement of the inaugural cities. So mid-May of 94 is when you started to get a little bit of the conversation of maybe this is going a little too fast. May 17th, you had the franchise bids that had already been due to the league organizers. 22 cities filed a bid. This came out on May 17th. Atlanta, Boston, Columbus, Dallas, Denver, Detroit, Greensboro, North Carolina, which was a shock, Houston, Indianapolis, Kansas City, New York, Los Angeles, Louisville, New Jersey, which were separate, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, Sacramento, San Jose, Seattle, Tampa, Tulsa, and Washington. Now, little bits of info about a couple of these. They'll start with Detroit. Roger Faulkner was the previous Detroit Express owner in the NASL. He was the chairman of the local World Cup organizing committee. He was proposing a stadium to be built on the Michigan State Fairgrounds. New York, the speculation was that the bid would center on a venue on Long Island. New Jersey, the two potential sites were Giant Stadium and Rutgers Stadium, and that bid was organized by Charlie Stilitano. Sacramento, they were looking at playing at Sacramento State University, which was the home of a Canadian Football League team at the time. San Jose was Spartan Stadium, which is where San Jose ended up starting their franchise. Tulsa was Skelly Stadium on the campus of the University of Tulsa. Orlando ultimately did not submit a bid. They sold less than 1,000 season ticket deposits. They couldn't come to terms with the Citrus Bowl on a lease agreement. Reportedly, they were given an extension. Memphis and Nashville, which is the first time we've heard about Nashville, was also given an extension to submit a bid. Chicago is another one who wasn't able to sort out a suitable stadium. Greensboro was the surprise. They submitted a bid instead of Raleigh. It was a skeleton bid, according to the organizers, just to show interest. MLS organizers were looking at it in conjunction with previous discussions with Raleigh Flyers owner Jim Goodman, who was also the owner of the Durham Bulls minor league baseball team. Greensboro, their bid included a proposed 20,000-seat stadium as part of a sports and entertainment complex near Kernersville, North Carolina. Also came out at this time that the league wanted teams in those 20 to 30,000 seat stadiums by the year 2000. That was the plan on paper in mid-94. May 27th, a report in the Herald News in Passaic, New Jersey, said that Hank Steinbrecher was tabbing New York and Los Angeles as virtual locks to receive franchises, mentioned Dallas, Detroit, and Tulsa as possible. Interesting how these early favorites were going. Out of those five, L.A. and Dallas, yes. New York ended up combining with the New Jersey bid later on, and Detroit and Tulsa didn't happen and still aren't in the league. Let's move to June, and we'll wrap at the midpoint of 1994 for this edition of Soccer Files. City still had a little bit of time to nail down their season ticket deposits, and on June 1st, Louisville announced that they had sold more than 1,000 individual season ticket deposits before any corporate support kicked in. They said that sales for these season tickets from individuals came from Cincinnati, from Bowling Green, from Lexington, from Southern Indiana. June 2nd, an article in the Boston Globe had Rothenberg saying that New England and Foxborough Stadium were prime candidates to join Major League Soccer. Paul Tierney joined the league's board of directors at this time. Some reports on the season ticket deposits started to leak out. Reportedly, Tampa sold less than 500 before the June 2nd deadline. Dallas sold 500. Phoenix sold around 700. Louisville over 1,300 and then sold 200 more the next day. Atlanta had sold less than 1,000. Detroit was mentioned at 2,500. Numbers weren't released in Sacramento. Bill Sage, that CEO of MLS, said they were short of where we would really like to see them. Reportedly at this time, Tulsa had sold 10,000 pledges. New Jersey was also linked with 11,000 season ticket deposits. Later reports had San Jose with 5,100 deposits, including a commitment for 2,500 from the California Youth Soccer Association North. Now, early June, news started to come out that MLS might not name all of the cities on June 15th, that some could be named later. That was not the original plan, but as you see from some of those season ticket deposit numbers, they weren't all where the league wanted them to be at this stage. June 10th, the Associated Press reported that the New York area could get two teams. And remember, there were two bids, two separate bids. One on Long Island that would have started at Hofstra Stadium, then moved to a nearby $30 million stadium to be built for MLS and the 1998 Goodwill Games. The other team would be based at Giant Stadium. MLS had already contributed $500,000 to that new stadium project, the one on Long Island. Further reports, and this is from the AP, said that San Jose and Columbus were seen as locks. Indianapolis, Tampa, and Louisville were all thought to have strong bids. So you're getting to the edge of the World Cup starting as well. So things are all over the map in soccer in the United States at the beginning of June in 1994. The U.S. men's national team was feeling the pressure here for not just performing well in the tournament, but also with what was going on with MLS. Frank Klopas said, like it or not, a lot of us are playing for our future jobs. Tab Ramos said, this is it. This is our last chance. So they knew how important their role was going into this tournament. June 13th, Louisville got some really bad news. The hopes were dashed when the Kentucky State Legislature refused to fund the new University of Louisville Stadium. That's where they were going to play. The stadium organizers were counting on the state issuing $7 million in bonds. The interim stadium, Cardinal Stadium, where the Louisville Redbirds played, where the University of Louisville's football team played, had artificial turf. It would have been shared with a minor league baseball team. It would not have worked for MLS. The Atlanta bid at this time was also hurt. DeKalb County officials were moving very slow on that $1.5 million renovation plan for DeKalb Memorial Stadium because all of the partnerships were not coming to bear just yet. So you had all these cities in all kinds of different stages at this time, and MLS had to make some decisions. They had announced that June 15th, they would tell you who was going to be in the league to start a year later. Actually, the league would have started less than a year later by this point. At Soldier Field on June 15th, MLS did make an announcement. It was 2 days before the first game of the World Cup, also at Soldier Field. They announced that their first season would be for 28 matches, and they announced that Boston playing at Foxborough, New York playing at Hofstra, New Jersey playing at Giant Stadium, Washington playing at RFK Stadium, Los Angeles, which was originally set to play at the LA Coliseum, San Jose at Spartan Stadium, and Columbus playing at Ohio Stadium with plans to build a stadium. They were awarded teams. Now, you heard that, and you're like, New York and New Jersey were awarded teams? They were. Boston, New York, New Jersey, Washington, LA, San Jose, and Columbus. 7. They were planning to announce 5 more. Now, 11 other cities were put into a secondary group, with 5 of them expected to get teams by August 1st. That secondary group, Atlanta, Dallas, Denver, Detroit, Houston, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Sacramento, Seattle, Tampa, and Tulsa. Louisville, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, Greensboro were eliminated at that stage. Also, Alan Rothenberg said that the league could start with a $50 million budget. That was down from the $100 million budget that was initially said. It's also less than the reported 2/3 of that original budget that was supposedly already ready to roll. The rest of the month had a lot of scrambling. First, the World Cup was kicking off, so you had a lot of things being talked about. But Indianapolis, who's in that secondary group, they were trying to figure out who was paying for what on the $1.3 million renovations of the Butler Bowl to make it suitable. Butler wanted a 5-year lease. You had a lot of back and forth going on there. Tampa had some issues with stadium signage that was under the control of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was difficult to get over the line here for MLS, as you're seeing. The World Cup started in Chicago on June 17th. The U.S. men's national team started their World Cup in Detroit at the Silver Dome on June 18th with a 1-1 draw against Switzerland. Got a lot of people excited. June 22nd in Atlanta, plans for the renovation of DeKalb Memorial Stadium were presented to the DeKalb School Board. A $7.8 million plan that included a field for MLS and a $6.2 million plan that would only be for a track and field venue. So he had two plans that were put forward to the school board. Former Georgia State Rep. John M. Lupton III presented the plans on behalf of Atlanta Management Services Incorporated. Lupton was not seeking any public bond referendum to finance the plans. He was already speaking with potential sponsors on all elements of the plans. The board said that money had to be in place before construction could begin, and that school athletic events would get top priority in scheduling. They also said they'd make a decision at a July 5th meeting. August 1st is the date that MLS had set for the announcement for the rest of their teams. Now, as you know, Game 2 for the U.S. men's national team was against Colombia, and the U.S. won in a huge upset, and that got everybody excited about soccer in this country. And after that win, the public debate was how many of the U.S. men's national team players would play in MLS. So as we wrap up the first half of 1994, you had some excitement with some great numbers on season ticket deposits. You had excitement with the U.S. men's national team getting off to a great start in the World Cup. People were talking about soccer. The World Cup was everywhere. You also had some hiccups. You had some markets that you would have thought would have been easy sells that were not part of this process or were hitting stumbling blocks. You weren't able to hit your $100 million financing goal to get started. You weren't able to hit your 12-team announcement before the World Cup started. So things were good in some ways for MLS. Things were also very shaky in some ways for MLS. That's the middle of 1994. Plans were still on track to start in 1995 with the first nationwide Division I professional soccer league in this country since the North American Soccer League folded at the end of the 1984 season. Things changed a little bit in the second half of 1994. We'll get into all of that on the next episode of Soccer Files. Thanks for hanging out and listening. If you have any questions, tweet at us at Soccer Down Here. Tweet at me at Longshoe. Would love to continue to dig deeper into this. If you have any threads you want to dig into, if you have any information you want to share, would love to get into it. That's what Soccer Files is all about. Thanks for hanging out and listening. Be back with the next episode of Soccer Files very soon.